I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about a fetal remains bill. There's a tremendous amount of information and misinformation that's come out as you regards to this bill, but nothing alters the impact of some of the comments that I've received from members of this chamber and from the public who expressed appreciation for the work that we're doing today to help those of us who have lost children to be able to handle some of the difficulties that we've dealt with. It's almost as if in many cases, one member made a comment to me, he said they had felt shunned. Another member who, in their times of doing this, was trying to explain how they felt, and this person's a person who was tough as nails, and they just held my hands and they started to sob, and they walked away. I still remember that fateful day in 1978. It affected me for the rest of my life. I've always prided myself in being a very tough Marine, and I'd seen things in my life that most people haven't seen, but nothing can prepare you for that moment when your life goes from pure joy to absolute abject sorrow in a nanosecond. And when the baby's delivered and you realize what's happened, and you're on the maternity ward and you're seeing other people experience the joys of their birth, and you're seeing the absolute trauma to your spouse if you've just lost a child, you go through unbelievable different emotions. I went through the emotions of trying to figure out what to do when I called my sister Pat. And Pat said to me, my sister Pat, who's now deceased, said to me, be sure you ask for the remains. And by the time we had done that, the remains had been disposed of. The hospital's perspective was that to help my family cope with this, to leave my wife on the maternity ward, and I found many people had the same experiences, and to have her walk off in the maternity ward when we were being discharged, walk right by the newborn baby so that she could understand that she was going home without a child. To this day, I don't understand why that's the case. But it affected me in ways that you can't possibly imagine. And there have been a number of things that have happened in the past couple of weeks. But I walked across the United States 5 years ago because of my son, Eddie. And I dedicated this book, and this is in the book. It says, I dedicate this book to my dad, who passed away when I was just shy of 4 years old, to my 4 children on earth who put up with me while I learned to be a father, to my 3 children who were miscarried, for whom I pray every day. When my wife collapsed as we were walking out of the hospital, and I realized that we had lost our child and we had lost the remains of our child, we wanted to craft something that was voluntary, that provided the family with the ability for closure, for the ability to deal with their loss, for the ability to understand that a human life was lost, their life that they've been striving for so long. I've seen couples that approached me when they first heard some of the misinformation about the bill, when they heard about what it was really about, said this is compassionate. In my own case, I became angry. I fell away from my church for a period of time. Then I realized that wasn't what this was about, and I shouldn't have been doing that. I decided to dedicate the rest of my life to helping children with disabilities, to help children who may have not been able to be born. But when the first reporter came out and wanted to talk to me about this, she made something she started to cry as I was talking. And she said, this is really personal to you, isn't it? And I said, like, you can't imagine. is I feel like the day that I die will be the happiest day of my life in my faith. I'll be seeing the face of God. I'll be seeing the face of my Savior. And all I worry about is, will my son, Eddie, be there and say, Dad, why did you abandon me? Why weren't you there to protect me, Dad? And as you look at that from the perspective of taking care of your family, there's no greater responsibility that a parent has than to do that. And I ask myself and beat myself up on that every single day. And I would merely ask that this bill is a voluntary perspective on the parents' part to be able to provide them with the understanding, the closure, and the compassion that they need as they struggle through an incredibly difficult time of their life, which perhaps only days earlier had been a moment of tremendous joy. So I would ask you that as you contemplate this bill, I would ask you for a yes vote.
You state that this legislation gives women a choice to decide whether or not to have a ritual disposal after the end of a pregnancy. How exactly does that work? Will the doctor have to ask each patient if she would prefer something different in line with her own personal and religious beliefs? If she chooses to do something different, will she have to take actual possession of the embryonic tissue? And if she chooses not to take the embryonic tissue home, is she required to contract with a funeral director?
In the first part of the scenario that you mentioned, it would be part of any informed consent that would be done as part of any medical procedure, medical process by which you've been admitted to a hospital. Any treatment plan would be included in that type of situation, as you do now. That's done candidly in every type of situation and treatment that's currently taking place. If the parent chooses not to have, and in that disclosure document would be the individuals acknowledging that they understand that they have the right to ask for the fetal remains. If there is a fetal remains desire to where they want to take the fetal remains, it would be transmitted, and the person would have it's not a death certificate as commonly mentioned. It is as is currently required, which is called a fetal death registration, which is currently in Pennsylvania law. That would be transmitted so that it would be able to go to any funeral home should it be so desired, or to a crematory if the family so desired for cremation.
Thank you. But it seems that the bill requires the health care facility to do many of these things. How is this, in your opinion, about providing the parents with an option? If you could explain, please.
The parent has the option if there's going to be a death of a fetus in which, or the child, in which the parent will be notified that they have the option of taking the remains or not. If they are silent, the parents don't respond, then it's done exactly as it is done currently, which is a simultaneous cremation is what a facilities. I was on a hospital board for 28 years, and that's the way it would typically be done. You have the fetal death registration that is currently already in Pennsylvania law, and that's the only thing for which there is a requirement on the facility. And the parents who choose not to do anything don't have any additional requirements. They can just allow the child to be handled by the facility the way it's currently done now.
If this is about simultaneous cremation, why could you please explain why this bill specifically requires the healthcare facility to have the burial, please?
I have to tell you, it's when you've lost a child, and I hear this about having the ability to have an impact and not to get politicians involved. You've already gotten involved when I was denied the right to take care of and provide for my son. I was already denied the right and have felt the remorse. And I've heard from unbelievable number of other people who have experienced that same trauma where they were denied that by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where we were not given the option to be able to handle our child and have them interred in a facility for our family. So we were denied that opportunity. So this is merely giving us a voluntary opportunity to say, if you wish the remains to be taken and be able to be interred with your family or cremated, the simultaneous cremation is for those families that choose not to have the baby's remains picked up. The hospital would still, the healthcare facility would still be able to use a simultaneous cremation as is currently done.
So it appears that the simultaneous cremation is only for the fetuses that are unclaimed, and that requires that they would have been taken to the morgue. Could you explain if that is your intent, please?
The current law, the way it's currently being done, would be done in the same process if the family does not wish to take control of their remains. The change occurs under this is if the family decides to take control of the remains, they would either be done through an interment or a cremation that would be done at the expense of the family who wishes to receive the remains.
Thank you. If I may ask a follow-up question, I appreciate your answers, and I also appreciate that this is a very sensitive and rightfully emotional topic, and I thank you for your thought on that. The bill, as I read it, requires a death certificate to be filed for each occasion a pregnancy ends in a health facility, thereby creating a database of abortions and miscarriages. Could you explain who would be able to request documents from this database? What are the protections in place to ensure a patient's privacy? And could you talk about the fact that the information is publicly available in 50 years? So I would be interested to know how you plan to prevent a patient's private medical information from becoming public record.
First and foremost, no death certificate is required under this bill. And under current law, outside the scope of this legislation under House Bill 1890, it's already a fetal death registration that is currently being done. And if there's a problem with that, then you should then consider looking at that aspect of the law. In terms of what access of information is available, that would ever be whatever the current existing law would require. But it's not, it's outside the scope of this bill.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your answers and your time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The bill states that a parent can choose an alternative disposition for the embryonic or fetal tissue. Presumably this means the patient and another person. Are there any provisions in the bill if the parties disagree with one another in the case of surrogacy, and also when there's an underage parent who is the parent of the fetal remains? Also, what notice provisions are there and who is responsible for providing notice, the hospital or the patient?
At this point in time, it will be between the patient and their physician, the one receiving the care. And it is silent on the issue if there's a disagreement, but it's between the patient that would be discussed.
Okay. Under current law, for second trimester abortions, the resulting medical tissue must be sent to a pathologist for review, sometimes occurring out of state. Would this bill remove that requirement? If the medical tissue is sent to pathologists out of state, would they be required to provide ritual burial or cremation? After a pathologist reviews the medical tissue, would the patient be forced to come back and file a death certificate? If the medical tissue must be sent back to Pennsylvania, this law states it must be embalmed or transported in a certain kind of metal box. What are the costs for embalming in special containers? Who will bear those costs?
I'm not sure which question. I can just answer them yes, 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 no, yes, yes, no.
Okay.
But you've asked a whole series of questions. So I would merely say is first, there is no death certificate, once again. And it's under current law, you have a fetal death registration. That is the document that would be used for the transmit of any material. But to answer your general question is no, there's no requirement other than what is currently in existing law for any tissue so transferred.
So to clarify, if I may, there would not be any requirement for fetal tissue sent out of state?
That's correct. There is no requirement.
Okay. In the interest in protecting taxpayers' costs related to this, in 2017 there were 137,771 live births in Pennsylvania. Typically 1 in 5 pregnancies end in miscarriage, so about 34,000 miscarriages occur in Pennsylvania each year. If approximately 1 in 10 happen in a medical facility, exclusive of any abortions that occur, are there any costs or monies allocated towards the impact on coroners and vital statistics?
There is no additional cost, number one. Number two, No medical institutions or healthcare facilities have objected to this. We've not heard from any healthcare providers. Number three, and I think equally as importantly, is any cost that would be incurred if a family so chooses to take their child and have it interred or cremated for a family burial, that would be incurred at the cost to the person who wishes to have those fetal remains.
Members, to inform you, this legislation is mirrored from a law that was passed in the state of Indiana. That bill was upheld by the United States Supreme Court. This very legislation that is before us today. I stand to lend my strongest support to House Bill 1890. This bill will go a long way in easing the grief and suffering and pain for women who have lost an unborn child. Mothers and fathers currently question what happened to the remains of my child. Since this bill was introduced, I have had several people come to me and share with me the importance of the bill to them. And that is the question that remains with them when they were not able to obtain the remains of the child. What happened to my unborn child's remains? This bill will give parents the comfort of knowing that they now will have the right to determine the resting place of their child's remains. Having this option can give tremendous help in alleviating the pain of wondering for the rest of your life what happened to my unborn child's remains. Parents now will not have to wonder, they can know. They can have the choice of deciding where the child is laid to rest. This is a compassionate bill for those who have miscarried and want those remains. They want those remains. They will have the option, Mr. Speaker, of obtaining those remains. This bill pays the greatest respect to women. It is not disrespectful. I am dismayed from the statements that I've heard from the other side of the aisle. This pays the greatest respect to mothers and fathers, respecting their wishes as a mother who chooses to have the remains of her child and who can determine where that child is laid to rest. Please support this compassionate bill so that mothers who lose their children have the right to claim their remains. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative, for sponsoring this great piece of legislation.
First of all, for the members that spoke today that have lost children, I will extend my heartfelt prayers and thoughts to you. I hope that you will accept them in the spirit that I offer them to you. I understand that many people may not agree with this, but please, I'd ask you not to mischaracterize the plain language of the bill. During this whirlwind that happened in the past couple of weeks, we had a situation in which a member made a comment and I had an opportunity to respond, and I responded with the dignity and the benefit of the doubt that I think the member intended it to be. And I would ask the same today. I heard two speakers attribute a motive to something that I've done, and I find that particularly painful in light of the loss that our family suffered. When we found out that we were expecting, my wife said to me, "We're pregnant." She never said, "I'm pregnant." You know, I have lost a father at a very young age, and so having the opportunity to be a dad means more to me than you can imagine. Taking care of children is my what I want. I don't want to be doing this. I want to be taking care of kids. And I would pray that anybody that's known me for the 3 years I've been here would not attribute a motive other than, let's give the person who has suffered the miscarriage the option to take care of their child as they see fit. That's all this bill does, and anything other than that is said about that is a mischaracterization. And I would ask you please for a yes vote on House Bill 1890.